see make sure one of them works at least. Hope that you have a paper for this morning. I don't know, some of you may not, but want to get started with discussing this morning what your hand finds to do, do it with your might. We think about that from Ecclesiastes chapter 9 and verse 10. The writer there says, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might, for there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol, to which you are going. In the grave, it'll be too late to get our work done. So we need to think about how we're handling things and doing things diligently while we can. This poem, I knelt to pray when day was done, and prayed, Lord, bless everyone. Lift from each heart the pain, and let the sick be well again. And then I woke again next day, and carelessly went on my way. The whole day long I did not try to wipe a tear from any eye. I did not try to share the load of any brother on the road. I did not even go to see the sick man just next door to me. Yet once again, when day was done, I prayed, Lord, bless every one. But as I prayed, to my ear came a voice that whispered, Dear, pause, hypocrite, before you pray. Whom have you tried to bless today? God's sweetest blessings always go by hands that serve him here below. And then I hid my face and cried, Forgive me, Lord, for I have lied. But let me live another day, and I will live the way I pray. How many times do we pray prayers like that? Asking God to help these folks, those folks, everybody else. But then how often do we follow through and be God's hands and be God's feet, to be his mouth to those who need to hear, his hands to those who need help? How often do we actually take the time and the effort to live out what we've prayed, to be his servants here on earth as we should? Unfortunately, many times one of two problems arises with people. Either they have a zeal without knowledge, or they have a knowledge without zeal. And I'm not sure which one is worse in God's eyes, but I know he's not happy with either. In Romans 10, 1 through 3, Paul talks particularly about those who have a zeal for God, but not the knowledge. The problem with that group is that they go about trying to set up their own rules and their own way of pleasing God without knowing what he wants them to do. And Paul prayed for those people that they might be able to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. But on the other hand, so many times James talks about those who know the good they ought to do and don't do it. And he said that's a sin as well. Both sides of that are problems that we need to be aware of. And so we, as we live our lives, we need to try to be sure that we know what we're supposed to be doing, but then that we do it zealously, with energy, fervently serving God in those areas where we know what he wants us to do. You know, sometimes we have a tendency to be a little blind to our own faults, don't we? It's so easy to see somebody else's. I could look out there and I could see if somebody's got a spot on their shirt, or if their hair's not quite right. Well, if they've got any hair. And you know, I can see those things in you, but I can't see whether my hair's good or not, or whether if I've got a spot on my shirt somewhere, I may not notice that. It's so easy to find the faults of others and overlook our own. And that's true as well when it comes to working for the Lord. So many times we fail to recognize our own laziness. We come up with excuses for it, for sure, but we overlook it, or we allow it to slide, and we've always got a good reason not to do the things God wants us to do. Those other folks, they're the lazy one. They won't do right, but I've got good reasons not to. And so we need to watch out for that. Proverbs 26 verses 13 through 16. The sluggard says, there's a lion in the road, there's a lion in the streets. That's a good reason not to get out, isn't it? I mean, there's a lion out there. Well, maybe there's not really a lion. Maybe he's just using that as an excuse. Sure, there are bears out there. Doesn't keep us from getting out and going, does it? They're not going to stop us. So sometimes we look for something that might be a danger of some kind. Well, there are car wrecks, so I don't want to drive. There's lightning when there's a thunderstorm or something, so I might get struck by lightning. We look for all the reasons not to do instead of doing. Now, that doesn't mean that God wants us to be careless and not think about dangers, but we need to be aware that we don't allow every little possible thing that could occur to keep us from doing what we should. He goes on to say in verse 14, as a door turns on its hinges, so does a sluggard on his bed. The sluggard buries his hand in the dish. It wears him out to bring it back to his mouth. Can you imagine being that lazy? Now, I've not yet met somebody who's so lazy they won't eat. In fact, usually the lazy folks eat as much or more than the working folks. But can you imagine being so lazy that you reach into the dish to get some food and it wear you out to think about bringing that all the way up to your mouth? Now, I have been that tired. I have been that sick. But just out of laziness, that's a degree of laziness that few ever reach. It wears him out just to bring it back to his mouth. But then he says in verse 16, the sluggard is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can answer sensibly. Again, he's always got it figured out. He's always got a reason. It doesn't make any sense, but it's his reason, and it's wiser to him than all of the reasons that other people can give. So we need to be aware of that, because there is a danger. And we see it in the world around us. We see a lot of laziness, and it's a dangerous thing. We even hear it in sayings. How many of you have heard, probably many of you have heard it recently, if not in the last week. I bet most of you have heard it at some point in your life, not too far back. How many of you heard, don't work too hard? You ever hear that one? Oh, yeah. Don't work too hard. Well, I mean, I know it's possible to work too hard. You can drop dead from working too hard, I suppose. But that's not much of a danger for most folks. There are very few people that are ever going to work too hard. The real temptation is not to work hard enough. And so we need to watch out for that. So as we think about putting our hands to work and doing it with all our might, we want to think about 3 things in this. And the first one is that life is short. We need to be active. We need to be finding what we can do and doing it with our might, because life is short. There's not always plenty of time. There's not always tomorrow. There's not always another chance later on. And so we need to be aware of that. In fact, our life is compared in the book of Job in chapter 14, verses 1 and 2, to being like a flower that withers. A flower doesn't last very long. A few days, maybe a week or two, and that flower fades and falls off, and it's dead and gone. And our lives are compared to that. Our life is compared to a vapor. It's like a vapor, James says in James chapter 4 and verse 14. Well, we know how a vapor, you are boiling some water on the stove and that little mist comes up, and it gets up about 2 or 3 feet above that pot, and then it just disappears, and it's gone. The mist, the fog that's there in the morning, the sun comes up, comes out, and by noon that's gone. There's no more. That fog's all gone away. It's just disappeared many times. So that mist, that vapor, that fog, it just doesn't last. There's no permanency to it. And that's the way our life is. Our life is also just compared to a day. John chapter 9, verses 4 and 5, Jesus says, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. He says, basically, you've got a day. That's your life. And then night's coming. That's death. So work while you can. Work while it's day. Work while you've got life in you. Death is certain and death is coming. Ecclesiastes 9:10 tells us. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. He talks about Sheol is the Hebrew word. It basically means the grave, death. He says in Sheol, to which you are going. Didn't say to which you might go. He said, you're going. I'm going. We're all going. Now, some of us will get there before others, but we're all going that way. And so we need to work while we can because our life is short. And so many people made plans for what they were going to do one day. What I'm going to do. I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. But they never get the chance to do this or that or the other thing because they don't live to see it. And since life is short, and since how we live this life will determine how we spend eternity, I need to be busy working. Since life is short, I need to be busy working, not just wasting my days away. We're going to be judged by our works, 1 Peter 1 and verse 17 tells us. If you call on him as Father who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile. He says, while we're here away from God, before we get to go home to be with him, we better be working. He's going to judge us according to our deeds. He's going to judge everyone impartially according to their deeds. We need to be sure we don't wait, but do it now while we have the opportunity. You know, sometimes we may run into somebody and we think, well, you know, I should invite them to church or I should talk to them about studying the Bible. Well, I'll do it next time. There's not always a next time. Sometimes that's the last time. I remember one lady, I'd actually had one study with her and we had set up another study, and that day she'd gone to the doctor. And she called me about an hour or so before we were supposed to meet, and she said, I've been to the doctor today and I just don't feel real good. Can we put this off till next week? And I said, okay, we can get together again next week. Well, she died that night. There was no next week. There wasn't even a next day. Now, I don't know that one more study with her would have convinced her to obey the gospel. I don't know that one study would have made that much difference. We'd only had one study, and many times it takes many more than that. I don't know. But I do know that was the last chance. I didn't know when we'd had that study the week before that was going to be the last one. I thought, well, we might have 3 or 4 or 10 or don't know how many more studies we might have. But that was the last one. And that's just it. Most of the time, we don't know when it's the last time. It just is one time. So we need to live life busy working because we don't know. Don't wait. Do it now, Jesus says in John chapter 4, verses 34 through 36. He says, don't say there are still 4 months until the harvest. I tell you, lift up your eyes. The fields are white to the harvest. We don't need to wait. Now, there are some things we can't do at a certain time. We have to wait. We understand that, right? But what Jesus is saying, when it comes to sharing the good news with someone, do it at the earliest opportunity because the harvest time is now. And we need to be doing that. We need to remember that our work for the Lord is never in vain. 1 Corinthians 15:58, he says, brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. There are many things in this life where we spend our time in vain. And sometimes we feel that way about the Lord's work. Sometimes we feel like, well, I invited that person 2,700 times. to come to church with me. I talked to this person 5,000 times. I talked to that person every day for 20 years. I just wasted my time. But Paul says there, no, your labor in the Lord is not in vain. That person may or may not respond, but the Lord knows the work that you did, and you'll be rewarded for that. It's not how that person responds that determines whether our work is in vain, but whether we are working for the Lord. Now, we certainly hope they'll respond. We hope they'll come to church. We hope they'll study the Bible. We hope they'll become Christians, but they don't always. And that's beyond our power. We can't make somebody obey the gospel. All we can do is teach and share and have an answer for the hope that's in us to give them whenever they ask. And take those opportunities as we have them. But working for the Lord's never in vain. We need to learn from the ant. Proverbs 6, verses 6 through 11 says, Go to the ant, O sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. Without having any chief, officer, or ruler, she prepares her bread in summer and gathers her food in harvest. How long will you lie there, O sluggard? When will you rise from your sleep? A little slumber, a little folding of hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man. Solomon says, you better work while you can. You better prepare, even if there's not a future. It's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. And that's basically what Solomon tells us, to learn that lesson from the ant. Some of those ants are going to die. They're never going to see that winter, but they prepared. The thing is, our preparations go far beyond just preparing for the winter or preparing for the next day. Our spiritual preparations especially are going to prepare for eternity. And we need to make sure that we're making those preparations as we have the opportunity and when we have this time that we have. Laziness is a destructive thing. We see that throughout the book of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes as well. It destroys. Proverbs 18:9. Whoever is slack in his work is a brother to the one who destroys. He says in Ecclesiastes 10 and verse 18 how it decays things. Laziness causes all of this. Through sloth the roof caves in, and through indolence the house leaks. You know, the fellow said, never fixed the roof because when it was raining, he didn't want to get up there on the roof to fix it, and when it wasn't raining, it didn't leak. So he never got up there and fixed that. Well, have you seen some of those old houses that nobody's worked on? You see the roof starting to cave in. You got several like that around out in the woods. And now a lot of them, it's because nobody even lives there anymore and they've just left to themselves. But sometimes they're ones people still live in, but they're just not taking care of it. Sometimes it's because they can't afford to. Sometimes it's because they can't physically take care of it in some way. But sometimes it's just because, well, they got better things to do. They got to spend that money on a new truck or a bass boat or something, and they don't have time and money to fix up that house they're living in. Laziness devastates. Proverbs 24 and verses 30 through 34. He says, I passed by the field of a sluggard, by the vineyard of a man lacking sense, and behold, it was all overgrown with thorns. If you ever garden at all, you know how quick the weeds will take over, don't you? If you don't keep them out of there, they'll be just a couple of days and they'll be out of control again. The ground was covered with nettles, its stone wall was broken down. I saw it and considered, and I received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of hands to rest, and poverty will come on you like a robber. So, it's just a little bit. And then, before long, you've lost out on all of it. And I know we might say, well, I'm not a lazy person. And in a lot of ways, maybe we're not. But we have a tendency to put work more into some things than others. And one of the things we put the work into are the things that we can see and touch, and they're urgent. We see the problem with that. But sometimes the things that are less obvious, less noticed, are the things where we tend to slack off a little bit. We never forget to put the gas in the car because, when that gas gets low, it dings at us and tells us, and we see that gauge that's showing it's empty. But sometimes we might forget, how long has it been since I did the oil change? When did I do that? We forget that one until the oil light comes on because it's run out of oil. And then we're in big trouble. And it's that way in our lives as well. We neglect sometimes ourselves and our own health. We neglect our spiritual life because it's not as visible to us as the physical things are. And we've got to be aware of that. We've got to watch out for that danger. So as we get to the final thing we want to think about is, if tomorrow doesn't come, will I be sorry? Will I be sorry that I didn't spend more time with those I love and less time on other things? Ecclesiastes 4:8, he says, one person has no other, either son or brother, yet there's no end to all his toil, and his eyes are never satisfied with riches. He never asks, who am I toiling for? Who's going to receive this? So there is that possibility of overworking for no purpose, putting yourself, working yourself to the grave and for no purpose, storing up riches that aren't going to be anybody's. So there's that danger, certainly. We need to be working on our relationships. We need to love people and use things and not use people and love things. We need to get that sorted out in our priorities. But will I be sorry that I didn't reach out more with the gospel? We sing that song. Well, I say we haven't sung it since I've been here. I assume it's in our, I haven't even looked in our songbook to see if it's there. But the song is often sung, when at the bar we stand in that better land. Will any lost one there be able to say to us, you never mentioned him to me. You saw me day by day and you knew I was astray, but you never mentioned him to me. How much sorrow would fill our hearts if we were standing on the day of judgment and people came and could say that you never even mentioned, I didn't even know you were a Christian. You didn't tell me. In Luke 16, verses 27 and 28, the rich man, in the story Jesus tells of the rich man and Lazarus, is begging for someone. He wants Lazarus to go. He wants anybody, go warn my brothers so they won't come here. Problem is, it's too late then. Too late. Who is there in your life that you would want to warn about the dangers of hell, or to encourage about the beauties of heaven? What are you waiting for? Warn them. Encourage them. Tell them the good and the bad. Let them know what the future holds. Will I be sorry I didn't live more for Christ and less for self? We have that song, none of self and all of thee, where they walk through those stages. All self at first, and then giving up self as the verses go along. Beautiful song. 2 Corinthians 5:15 says that he, Christ, died for all, so that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him. Are you living for him? Or are you living for yourself? Now we all have things that we have to do to live, or we won't be living for him or ourselves or anybody. But beyond those things, what are we doing for him? Now, whatever our life circumstances are, we can be living it for him. We don't all have to be preachers of the gospel to be living for Christ. I know some people think that, oh, well, that's the preacher. We can all be living for Christ out there every day on our jobs, around our friends, with our families and neighbors. We're living for Him. The prayer a while ago was mentioned that we be Christians 7 days a week and not just on Sunday when we're here. And that's part. We live our lives for Him. He died for us so that we would live for Him. Will I be sorry I didn't lay up more treasure in heaven and less on earth? Matthew 6:19 through 21, Jesus warns us that. Don't lay up treasures on earth. Moth, rust, thieves. It's not a safe place for your treasures. Maybe you've heard the story about the man that went to heaven, and he got there, and as the stories always go, St. Peter's showing him around, right? And he's showing him the mansion, beautiful mansions, and they keep on. He's like, "Is this? No, we got a long way to go." They finally get down. There's this little shack of about 3 sticks stuck together. He's like, "What? All those beautiful mansions?" He's like, "Well, we can only build with what you send up here." And that's true. If we haven't laid up our treasures in heaven, we're not going to have any treasures when we get there. And any we lay up here are going to get left behind for somebody else. We can't take them with us. As we think about this, Revelation 22 and verse 12, toward the very end of the Scriptures, Jesus Himself says, "Behold, I am coming soon, bringing my recompense with me to repay each one for what he has done." He's coming. He's going to pay us. What's your paycheck going to look like? Going to get a good check? Or are you going to get one that you can't pay off your bills with? What's it going to be like when He comes? Again, James 4:17 tells us, the one who knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, it's a sin. There was one man who was hired for a job. The farmer was looking for a hand to work on his farm. And he said, when they were talking about the job, he says, "Well, I can sleep when the wind blows." Farmer didn't really understand that. But he went ahead and hired the man and been working there a few days, and then up came a storm one night. Oh, the farmer jumped up out of bed. The wind's blowing, the lightning's crashing, and he goes and he wanted to check everything out. Where's that farmhand? Farmhand's fast asleep. Farmer wakes him up. What are you doing asleep? There's a storm. He said, "Well, I told you I can sleep when the wind blows." "Well, what about all that?" No. He had taken care of everything. He had locked everything up. He had protected everything that needed protection before the storm came, so that when the storm came, he wasn't worried. He didn't have to be scared of what was happening because he had prepared for the storm. Like that wise man that built his house on the rock. When the waves crashed against it, it stood because he was prepared. I hope that this doesn't describe any of us, but if it is, it's time to make a change. I've been a dead weight many years around the church's neck. I've let the others carry me and always pay the check. I've had my name upon the rolls for years and years gone by. I've criticized and grumbled too. Nothing could satisfy. I've been a dead weight long enough upon the church's back. Beginning now, I'm going to take a wholly different track. I'm going to pray and pay and work and carry loads instead, and not have others carry me like people do the dead. What about you this morning? Are you carrying your load? Are you working for the Lord? Are you working and keeping yourself busy because the night is coming? If you're not, maybe you haven't even been hired. If you're not a Christian, you're not even on the job. You're not going to get a paycheck. Better get on track. Better get that job. Get to work for the Lord. If you are a Christian but you haven't been doing what you should for the Lord, maybe you need to make some changes to make things better. Things you need to repent of, things you need to start doing, like in that last poem. If you have a need to respond to God's invitation for any reason, please do so as we stand and as we sing.